My parents were from Vienna, and though they knew precious little about music, we didn't even have a piano, and they didn't play instruments, they liked classical music, and they passed that along to their children. As refugees from the Holocaust, I think they spent all 90-some years of their lives deeply missing the city they'd left behind as teenagers. There were a few things they'd been able to take with them, a particular doll, a few odd household items, but those were stored away. What was present in this new country, however, no matter where they lived, was Mozart, and he was a constant presence in our household. That's the first music I remember hearing, and it's the first great music I played when I finally persuaded my parents to get an old upright piano and let me start taking piano lessons at the ripe old age of 7. I played something called Papageno's Magic Melody, which I adored. I still remember the cover of that music. To this day, for me, it's the music of Mozart and Schubert, two of Austria's native sons, that resonates most deeply and personally. When I was a child in St. Louis, the symphony presented outdoor opera in summer, and I must have been very young when I first saw The Marriage of Figaro, so it seems like a great place to start. I have to tell you that pianists live in a perpetual state of unrequited desire. And what I'm really aching for in this lecture on Mozart, even now, is an orchestra and a whole crew of singers. So starting with that wonderful opera seems right in every way. The combination of sadness and joy, the ebullient conversations across gender, class, age, and just about every other possible divide, and the final reconciliation with a wrong made right informs so much of what Mozart had to say. In the opera, it's with text, but even there, the words are secondary. Mozart is always about reconcilable differences, and so very often there's a feeling in the end that all's well that ends well, no matter how deeply one knows that that's not really the case. Mozart bestows benedictions. In The Marriage of Figaro, a comic opera filled with silly misunderstandings, people hiding behind chairs, people jumping out of windows, the final scene of forgiveness could not be more profound. It makes us weep with its truth and generosity. The Count, who has all along deceived his wife, apologizes to her, and she, with utter radiance, accepts his offering. He says, "My lady, forgive me." And she says, "How could I refuse?" Hidden behind all the drama, both silly and profound, are some subversive verities about social standing in late 18th century Austria. Figaro is a mere servant, an upstart, but he, and especially his brilliant fiancée, Susanna, who should have had the opera named after her, are infinitely more clever than the aristocratic Count, and they do an excellent job of letting him know it. Significantly, the Beaumarchais play on which the libretto is based was censored in Vienna and not allowed to see the light of day. The opera's rebellious overtones, however, were apparently more subtle than those in the play, and it was allowed to sneak through. In general, music enjoyed a privileged position in that society, and to me, that poses a perennially fascinating question. Why is it that such an enormous portion of the West's great music came out of Vienna in the late 18th and 19th century, but so comparatively little of its great painting and literature? While Wordsworth and Blake wrote in London, and Ingres and David painted in Paris, Mozart and Beethoven composed in Vienna. There are many, many possible answers to that question, but I do think some of the answer lies in political realities. The Habsburg Empire was already a relic among more progressive European nations in the late 18th and early 19th centuries when Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert were in their primes. Long after the French and the English had had their revolutions, Austria was still mired in its old-fashioned monarchical ways. And part of that old-fashionedness was the support of rich aristocrats for a steady supply of new music. The aristocrats no doubt liked music itself. Goodness knows they had some good music to choose from, but they also liked it because it wasn't threatening. It didn't boast words or images laden with hidden radical ideas. And even an opera like The Marriage of Figaro that flaunted egalitarian thoughts had the good grace to bury them amidst pretty tunes. In a world that was spouting change and revolution, those tunes, enchanting but not threatening, were just what precarious rulers, as well as their populations who were subject to repression and censorship, needed to stay afloat. So we're going to talk about those tunes, as well as the context Mozart placed them in. We'll find that economy of means and familiar patterns are not just trivial aspects of this writing. They're the essence of Mozart's language. The question is, what makes them resonate so deeply? We sense in this music always the child prodigy, for whom the language of music is so apparently effortless. Mozart takes all the conventions governing harmony, melody, and formal structure that governed the high classical period, and then he makes them sound magical. How does he do that? How do you take a language where expectations are so strongly established and so many formulas are readily available and make it all sound like your own, let alone mine and yours, almost 250 years later? Let's start with those predictable aspects. Listen to the openings of these three unrelated movements from various piano sonatas, and then we'll talk about what unites them. I'm going to start by playing the beginning of Koschel 331, Sonata in A major. Then the beginning of the third movement of Koschel 333, which is Sonata in B flat major. And lastly, I'll play you a little snippet from Koschel 576, Sonata in D major. This is the first movement. I wonder if you notice the similarities. Just to place them in relief, let me play you, by way of contrast, the opening of Chopin's G minor Ballade, written some 50 years later. Where Mozart starts briskly and logically, Chopin takes pleasure in meandering. It takes him 8 measures to get to the point, while the key and first themes of the Mozart sonatas are unmistakable from the first measure. It's clear which of these composers lived in the age of reason. So listen again to how each of Mozart's pieces begins obediently with a perfectly balanced 4 or 8 measure phrase. The first half ending on the dominant, or 5th note of the key we're in, and the second half taking us firmly back to the tonic, the home note of the key. Here's the first example. Herschel 331. That's the dominant. And that's the tonic. Here's the next example, the third movement of Herschel 333. Dominant. Tonic. And the last example, Herschel 576. Dominant here and tonic. Certain chord progressions are expected, certain outcomes inevitable. The forms, here they were variation, rondo, and sonata respectively, are relatively standard as well. And Mozart was amenable to loads of the formulas that are endemic to the style. They frequently serve as a kind of neutral filler. They facilitate transitions, they emphasize a particular key, and they might occur interchangeably in different compositions. Let me give you an example from a random page. This is the first movement of the Sonata in B-flat, Herschel 333. You heard a bit of the last movement already. And it devotes itself through rapid scales and broken chords to preparing a big cadence. So it starts with scales, more scales, more scales, broken triads, and a big trill. Wonder if you noticed the left hand that crept in there. That broken triad's called an Alberti bass. It sounded like this. The 18th century composer Domenico Alberti was apparently an early devotee, but Mozart seems to have outdone him. You'd have to search long and hard to find anything Mozart composed for the piano that doesn't use an Alberti bass somewhere along the line. And finally, did you hear that flourish with which Mozart ended the phrase? That trill is called a cadential trill, and those two adorn everything that Mozart wrote. All these could easily become blueprints were there nothing more to the music. Add to that the necessity to produce music playable by amateurs. While Mozart's great piano concertos were performed frequently by Mozart himself, at larger venues, the sonatas were designed more for salons where pyrotechnics weren't likely to be successful. After all, this new keyboard instrument that Mozart was writing for, the forte piano, was the locale for many an amorous encounter in the late 18th century. Think of all Jane Austen's heroines at the keyboard. And of course, young ladies were obliged to display their musical accomplishments before promising suitors, whether their accomplishments merited display or not. It's clear that Mozart was deeply constrained. So what allows all those 4+4 measure phrases to rise above the mundane? How does simple arithmetic performed by an amateur become sublime? First of all, let's go back to those melodies. Some composers are greater melodists than others, and Mozart is way up at the top. Melodies come pouring out of him. Actually, I found it kind of funny how I've had to contort myself to try to figure out what makes those melodies so particularly wonderful when he apparently didn't need to contort himself in the slightest to come up with them in the first place. Misery loves company. So I invite you to share in my contortions, and I'm going to play you snippets of a few of my favorite melodies to see if we can together decode his secret, though I'll warn you ahead of time, we can't. I'll start again with another melody from The Marriage of Figaro. and you have to forgive the ample presence of opera in this lecture. I do know that you signed up for a course on the piano. This is truly not a bait and switch. We pianists spend our lives trying to sound like singers. I remember very clearly a piano teacher of whom I was none too fond saying to me as a 9-year-old that I should make it sing. That advice annoyed me enormously since I didn't like to sing and I had no idea what my fingers had to do with my vocal cords. But I'm afraid I now admonish my students similarly, day in, day out. The fact is that notes begin to die, to decay on the piano as soon as they're given birth. If I play this note, soon it's barely there. Whereas the human voice, and almost every other instrument, can sustain or even grow on a single note. The notes stay alive. So understanding melody on the piano depends totally on listening to singers and on trying desperately to create the illusion that pianists can create a similar line. Therefore, let's listen. This is the wonderful aria Dove Sono, sung by the Countess as she grieves over the deceit of her husband long before the apology he proffers at the end of the opera. Do you notice the simple repetition embedded in it? Mozart takes an unassuming idea and just repeats it, starting on a different pitch. Then he repeats the whole thing, varying it only toward the end. Pretty soon, it's our tune, and that's a deep solace. Here's the opening idea. And here it is on a different pitch. Now he's going to repeat the whole thing. Now a slight variation. Of course, repetition alone is hardly sufficient. Hearing a bad tune once, let alone twice, 3 or 4 times, is already far too often. But that's not Mozart's problem. Listen to this one, such a typically Mozartian melody found at the beginning of the clarinet trio, the so-called Kegelstatt trio, written for clarinet, viola, and piano. The piano gets to play this tune after both the viola and the clarinet have already stated it, so sustaining instruments have already provided a happy model for the clunkier piano. The melody's filled with the small arabesque figures that occur so frequently in Mozart. They add enormously to its everlasting grace. Like so much great music, this music dances, and one can't help moving one's body as one plays or listens to it. Again, do you hear the repeating pattern, as well as the question-answer symmetry of the phrase structure, and of course, the ever-present cadential trill? Here's the first idea. Here's a fragment, repeated, repeated, developed, same fragment, repeated, repeated, first idea again. Climbing by sequence. Finally, there's this, a solo work, and one of the most beautiful moments in all the piano sonatas, from Koszul 310, the sonata in A minor, the final movement. We're coming out of a rough, jagged, relentless section in the home minor key, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in the parallel major key, and you really feel like you're in the company of angels. Lots of familiar things to be heard in all those examples. The small range of the melody, balance in the phrase structure, a thin texture that highlights the melody, and lots of sequential repetition. In this last one, we come across a critical attribute that we've spoken about a bit and we'll speak about more in the next lecture. That's moving from one emotional state to another within a single movement with no ostensible transition. Bach didn't do that very often. He sequestered different emotional states in different movements. This is an achievement of the high classical style. So, if you'll forgive my dissecting a miracle, let's look at how Mozart does it in that one tiny example I just played. First off, he takes the dotted rhythm of the preceding melody and carries it over. The minor was like this, and the major begins like this. He also takes the thirds, which harmonize that original tune. And he takes the descending scale. In the minor, it sounded like this. In the major, it sounds like this. He also takes the running eighths of the preceding left-hand accompaniment and carries that rhythm over. So it was this, and that becomes this. Voila. The carryovers are all subconscious. What we know is that we're in a different universe, and we've arrived there at lightning speed with nary a bump. That's rocket science. Finding ourselves in the company of angels actually is also something of a commonplace in Mozart. I want to close this lecture by introducing you briefly to one of the lesser-known and earlier sonatas, Koszul 282 in E-flat major. It's a short sonata, and it's a wonderful example of how Mozart uses such bafflingly simple means to write such bafflingly beautiful music. Even in a brief glance, we can look at all the components we've mentioned, melodies, harmonies, phrase structures, transitions, and try to understand why this music touches us so deeply. This is the only one of his piano sonatas that begins with such a slow movement. Here's the first half of that movement. I'm struck here by the eloquence of that opening idea, again moving from 1 to 5 and back to 1. Five. And then by the enormously soothing effect of the entrance of 16th notes in the left hand. They're imperturbable, and their rocking motion feels so reassuring after the loneliness of those opening measures. The minor harmonies that complete the passage are obviously sad, but I think those continuing left-hand 16ths, so unflustered, provide a safety rail. The passage that follows is perhaps the most wondrous because it could not be more simple. We move into the major mode, the left-hand 16ths continue, this time in a block triadic formation, and the right hand outlines broken triads, going up, then down, with the idea repeated twice in perfect symmetry. We come back to our original question. How can something that simple be that powerful? I think it wouldn't be if we'd started at that moment. We had to arrive out of a different emotional state. That state makes us grateful for the arrival of a major tonality and stable triads because we've been immersed in minor coloration and dissonance and at the end, restless harmonies that shifted on every 16th note. Listen to that once more. The minor, the dissonance, and now the rapid shifts. We're grateful for the presence of that ongoing motion when we started out so static. And now, but most fundamentally, I think we're grateful for the melodic pattern itself, for the inevitability of the answer it provides to the stated question. We deeply crave that certitude. It must all come back to the Count and the Countess. Maybe like the Count, we've been granted absolution.